What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the March 2019 format. You know, some people may find it difficult to afford cards like a playset of Sky Striker Engage, or a playset of Infinite Impermanence, or a playset of Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay, but that doesn't mean you can't afford to play some really powerful decks that are actually like tier 2, tier 3 for a relatively budget price. For this video, we're going to be covering decks that are in the $100 to $150 price range, covering both main and extra deck, and have a fairly good shot at winning you a locals or regionals, and can even maybe hold its own in a YCS as well. So before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. And if you really love the content that I produce on this channel, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because it's thanks to people like Brandon that I'm able to bring you this content on a daily basis. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So kicking things off with number 5, we have Dark Warrior Turbo, aka Azathoth Turbo. Now, where did this deck go? Because this was actually a very prominent deck not too long ago, and I think what happened was a deck like Danger Orcus kind of just like eclipsed Dark Warrior, because both of these decks effectively have a very similar win condition in that they're very good at establishing an extremely powerful turn 1 board. The thing is though, Danger Orcus is much better at going second because it can do all the shenanigans and end on like Boral Sword and just kill your opponent while also simultaneously breaking their entire board apart. So the thing is with Dark Warrior, while it is capable of doing that as well, I think Danger Orcus is much more equipped to do this because they basically just have to resolve a Nightmare Mermaid and that's about it. But that doesn't mean Dark Warrior has really lost any of its potency. It just kind of fell down a few rungs on the tier ladder, but that's perfectly fine. This deck is very, very affordable because the main deck is comprised primarily of all these warrior cards, which are very cheap. They're not very high rarity, and because you're playing a combo deck, you don't really need to play a ton of hand traps. That's one of the things about being a budget player, that the barrier to entry for these decks can sometimes be restricted by the fact that you need hand traps. But if you're playing a heavy combo-centric deck like Dark Warrior, you don't need any of those hand traps. You can completely forego them, and then you just have as many combo pieces as possible to combo off and kill your opponent. If you're going first, you're going to try to set up Azathoth with like a Rusty Bardich or anything like that, maybe some Fog Blades in the back row, and then if you're going second, you're going to do your best to break your opponent's board, because since the main deck is so cheap, you can afford to buy some more expensive extra deck cards like Nightmare Unicorn, Borolo Dragon, maybe even a Boral Sword Dragon if you can find a good price on one, and then you're going to be good to go. I still think this deck is very, very good, especially at the price point, and that's why I made it into the number 5 slot. But moving on to number 4, we have another combo-centric strategy in Guard Dragon Crusadia. Now, this deck had a lot of hype coming out of YCS Chicago because I think 2 of them managed to make the top 32, and a lot of people were kind of getting on this hype train because the deck is really, really good. I mean, the fact that you're able to establish a board with multiple negates, I'm talking like 3, 4, sometimes even 5 forms of a negation, because you've just got so many powerful things like Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, you've got Gamma Seal with multiple negations. Like, the boards that Crusadia Guard Dragon can create are just absurd, but then you can also pair that with the fact that even if you go second, because you're playing a Crusadia strategy, you have a built-in OTK factor in Crusadia Equimax. So that gives you a nice diverse set of tools that whether you win or lose the die roll, you're going to be very well off. Again, very similar to Dark Warrior, because you're playing a combo deck, you don't necessarily need to rely on hand traps. You can maximize on your combo pieces, which is going to ultimately up your consistency. And yeah, the deck is similar again to Dark Warrior because their combo decks have a little bit of a learning curve, because you have to learn how to do these very intricate combos so that you ultimately can consistently perform them at higher tiers of competitive play. But regardless, that doesn't take away from the power that this deck provides. I think the biggest weakness when it comes to this deck is the fact that there are very specific points in the combo that if you get hit by a hand trap, you might be just left dead in the water, specifically with cards like Ash Blossom and Joy Spring and Effect Veiler running around in mass. Now that we have a lot of other decks in the meta that are playing these cards, I think that's the biggest thing you have to worry about. But you can run stuff like Called by the Grave, which is a common, so that's very easy to acquire, and ultimately it's just a very well-rounded deck for what it is. Again, I think we've just started to see the meta kind of settle out now, and I think with the uptick in particular hand traps that happen to be kind of a very, very weak point of the deck, that's something you do have to keep in mind, but it could still take you the distance, and ultimately we've seen the deck perform, so that definitely makes it worthy of my number 4 slot. Now moving on to number 3, we have a deck that has just managed to keep making its way into the top cuts of YCSs, and that is True Draco. Man, I cannot believe that Draco has managed to survive this long. Granted, the hits it's taken, I mean, Masterpiece is banned, and yet Draco is still able to compete at the highest tiers of competitive play. The best part about Draco, if you're a budget player, is that you don't need an extra deck, so that just exponentially cuts the price of this deck down. There are some expensive cards. I know Ignis Heat's been on the rise since Draco has still seen popularity. You've got stuff like Card of Demise and things like that, but ultimately, you're able to assemble the entire main deck for a fraction of the price of specific meta decks, and if you're okay with the playstyle, I know not a lot of people may like the idea of just, you know, playing a helmet-esque deck where you just set cards pass, kind of hope that your opponent can't break through your floodgates, and ultimately that's how you win the game. It's a very control-style deck, but what I really like about Draco is that even if the deck goes second, because you have the True Draco spells and traps that can be tributed for your Draco monsters, it actually helps break your opponent's boards, and I think that's really neat that the deck can do that. The deck's also super consistent because you can play almost every single draw spell in the game. That whether or not should be at 3 is debatable, but that adds to the consistency of this deck. Being able to play some of the strongest floodgates in the game pretty much completely unhindered is very powerful if your opponent cannot out them. I think the biggest weakness that Draco has going into this format is that going into the side decks game 2 and 3, I think your opponent is going to have a lot more cards to answer your board, stuff like Pankratops, Twin Twister, Red Reboot, Evenly Matched, things like that. So their deck composition is going to be entirely different than what you saw in game 1, and ultimately that's going to make or break whether or not you're going to go the distance with Draco. But it's been able to get top 16s at numerous YCSs in the past month, and it just continues to rear its ugly head. So if you like the playstyle, definitely consider Draco, because I definitely think it's worthy of that number 3 slot. But moving on to number 2, we have a deck that has probably been every budget player's wet dream for the past several years now, and that is Pendulum Magician. Yes, Pendulum Magician, again, making its way onto the top 5 competitive budget decks, because this deck continues to perform at such a high competitive level and continues to actually make its presence known in the metagame. What's very interesting about how the meta is currently shaping up is that we're starting to see a lot more hand traps re-enter the metagame because of what the top decks are able to include in their main deck. And the thing is, when it comes to Pendulum Magician, it doesn't really care too much about hand traps. That's one of the nice things. It's another combo-centric deck, and by being able to just play as many combo cards as possible, hand traps don't really do a whole lot, especially the ones that are being played in this specific metagame. There is cards like Ghost Ogre that can be very crippling for a deck like Pendulum Magician because of cards like Heavy Metal Foes Electromite, and Ghost Ogre is just like naturally good against Pendulum Magician, or any Pendulum deck for that matter. But at the same time, being just really good against cards like Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, things like that, it's honestly not too bad. Not to mention, you have a deck that can make stuff like Azathoth or like Kali Yuga, which is just a better Azathoth, honestly. I mean, the fact that it's like a 3,500 body and just negates like literally everything, not just like monster effects, is kind of crazy. You can set up boards that just have multiple negations on turn 1, and if you're going second, you can just like vomit your entire hand onto the field because you have the Pendulum summoning mechanic. Just continue to break your opponent's board because you have that extra push granted to you from the Pendulum mechanic, and you can just go in and OTK your opponent so easily. I think one of the weaknesses of this deck, though, is that it can be a little bit clunky depending on like how your hands look, and at the same time, while it is fairly consistent, the sideboard games 2 and 3 are going to be a little bit rough for you, with people siding in heavy amounts of spell removal, which is basically going to mess up with your Pendulum scales or anything like that. But ultimately, this deck has been able to perform at the highest tiers of competitive play. Very similar to Draco, it's managed to make top 16s at YCSs. I think like 3 different Pendulum Magicians topped the Pro Play Games Tour in Orlando, which I know it's a lower tier event, but it has an adequate number of high skilled players, probably more so than a smaller regional might, so that is something to keep in mind. And honestly, Pendulum is probably going to continue to be one of the budget players' best options for the foreseeable future until they just manage to hit more cards. But it's also a nice investment as well, because we still don't have Odd Eyes Revolution Dragon, so the deck can actually actually continue to get better, and is honestly a really good option if you want to have something to play in the March 2019 format. So that brings us to our number one competitive budget deck of the March 2019 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, oh man, it's Salamangreat, because this deck is absurd. Basically, just buying 3 structure decks is only $30, so you still have, what, $70 to $120 left by the criteria I listed in this video, and there are builds of this deck that are around the $100 to $150 price point range that have been able to top some of the highest of tier events that we have. And yeah, obviously, if you have more expensive cards like Infinite Impermanence, like Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay, the deck is only going to continue to get better and your matchups are going to be more favorable in particular instances, but you don't necessarily need those cards to be able to compete at the highest tiers of competitive play. You can be perfectly okay just running something like an Artifact engine, which we've seen the Artifact Salamangreat builds have a lot of success. You could play a very aggressive going second triple Fusion of Fire build, and that would be a good way that you can just blatantly OTK your opponent for no reason, because Violet Chimera is just that incredible of a card. There's so many different directions you can take it, and because so many of the cards are accessible not only from the structure deck but also from the previous structure deck, I believe the Power Code Link structure deck, then you have all the tools there. You just need to include a couple things. Ash Blossom is as cheap as it's ever been thanks to the reprint in the structure deck, and you're basically good to go. If there is ever a time to start getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh, or maybe get one of your friends back in who had troubles affording to play the game, Salamangreat is the reason you should pick up Yu-Gi-Oh again, because the deck is insanely consistent, it's super powerful, it's a ton of fun, and that's why it's my number one competitive budget deck of the March 2019 format. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this list, and if there's any other competitive budget decks that you might want to include as well, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.